It's been almost a year since that Guyana Defense Force helicopter crash shook the nation, right? 5 servicemen lost their lives, and we were all left wondering what exactly happened.
Yeah.
Now it seems like we're getting closer to some answers.
Okay.
With a draft of the final report finally finished. We're diving deep today into an article from News Source Guyana published, well, just yesterday, November 13th, 2024. The title, Draft Final Report of GDF Helicopter Crash Completed. So, where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think what really grabs you about this case is the sheer number of groups involved in this whole investigation.
Oh, yeah.
This goes way beyond just the GDF. You've got the National Transportation Safety Board in the mix. You've got Transport Canada, even Bell Helicopters themselves, and of course the Guyana Civil Aviation Authority. They're all reviewing this report.
It's a huge thing.
Each stakeholder, each one, gets a full 60 days to give feedback. That's a pretty intense process.
It definitely says they're going for a very thorough analysis, but we have to talk about a big twist, right? The black box. That's the flight data recorder. It was damaged in the crash. So what does that even mean for an investigation like this?
Losing the black box, it's almost like losing your main witness.
Oh, wow.
Think of it as like the ultimate storyteller for the flight.
Right.
Capturing all that data, altitude, speed, what the pilots were doing, even their conversations. Without it, investigators, they've got this huge challenge trying to piece everything back together.
So where do you go when that crucial part is missing? I mean, what do they do?
It becomes this incredibly careful forensic analysis.
Oh, wow.
They scrutinize every single bit of evidence they do have. It's like a detective coming a crime scene, right?
Yeah.
They'll pore over the wreckage, weather reports, radar data, maintenance logs, anything that could give them a clue.
And in this particular case, there's another really important source of information.
Right.
We have the 2 survivors, LT Ondio Crawford, who was one of the pilots, and engineer Tree L. Dwayne Jackson. They both gave statements.
Okay.
But it seems like the GDF is being pretty guarded about what those statements actually say.
Yeah, and you can understand why, to be honest.
For sure.
Survivor testimonies, they can be so sensitive. Just think about what they went through.
Absolutely.
They might hold key details about what the crew was doing, maybe even their mental state or any technical issues that came up. The GDF being cautious, it makes sense. They probably want to protect the investigation's integrity and make sure that final report is based on solid facts, not speculation.
It's walking a fine line, isn't it? Protecting the investigation while also wanting to give the public answers, which they deserve.
Right.
Speaking of answers, this article hints at pilot error as a possible factor in the crash. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, I'm really curious about how investigators would even approach that angle. What exactly does pilot error mean, and what kinds of things would they be looking at?
It's super important to remember that pilot error isn't just this simple single thing.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
It's like an umbrella term covering so many possibilities.
Wow.
From misjudging altitude to, reacting poorly under pressure. Investigators are going to look at everything about the pilot, their training, experience, and of course, their actions leading up to the crash.
Yeah.
Even small details like fatigue or changes in procedure.
So it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And we're trying to solve a puzzle, but we might be missing some pieces, especially because the helicopter involved, the Bell 412, it has this reputation for being reliable. It's used everywhere. So knowing that, what would investigators be focusing on about the helicopter itself?
Well, even the most reliable machine can have wear and tear, right?
Yeah.
So they'll be looking deep into the maintenance records, its entire service history,
Okay.
and any past incidents, especially with this specific model. They'll be searching for any patterns, any red flags that someone might have missed.
So we're not just looking at the pilot's actions, we're looking at the whole lifespan of this helicopter leading up to that moment.
Yeah.
And while all the technical stuff is super important, we can't forget the human element here.
Right.
5 servicemen died in this crash. Commander of the 1st Infantry Battalion, Cole, Michael Shahood, veteran pilot L.T. Cole, Michael Charles, L.T. Cole, Sean Welcome, retired Brigadier Gary Beaton, and Sea Steward Jason Kahn. Their loss just shows how serious this investigation really is.
Absolutely. This is about real people, families who are grieving. It's about the impact on the whole GDF community.
Yeah.
The findings of this report, they'll have a ripple effect.
Sure.
Not just on aviation safety, but also on the public's trust in the GDF's ability to protect and serve.
Which brings us to a really important point, don't you think?
Okay.
This isn't just happening in a bubble.
Right.
We have to think about transparency, the GDF's commitment to being accountable, and the public's right to know the truth. But with that damaged black box and possibly sensitive information from the survivors, how much are we really going to learn from this final report?
It's a good question.
Will we get definitive answers, or will there always be questions?
That is the million-dollar question. And it goes right to the heart of this tension between being open and transparent versus protecting the investigation itself. Some details might be held back to avoid impacting any legal proceedings or future safety measures.
I can see that.
But if there's not enough transparency, it could lead to people speculating, and that can erode public trust even further.
It's a tough balancing act. The stakes are so high.
Yeah.
Everyone will be watching to see what this final report says and what the GDF does next. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the Bell 412 itself. What are its main features, and are there any known weaknesses or past incidents that might be important in this case?
Sure. The Bell 412 is kind of like the reliable workhorse of helicopters. Yeah. It's really well known for being versatile. It can handle so many different types of missions. Search and rescue, troop transport, you name it. You'll find these things operating all over the world, even in tough environments.
So it's not exactly a newbie in the aviation world, which kind of makes you wonder, if it's so reliable, what exactly would investigators be looking at with the Bell 412 in this crash?
Well, they're going to dig into its history, see if any issues have popped up before with this model.
Makes sense.
For example, some helicopters, they're more susceptible to certain weather conditions, or maybe they have weaknesses that only show up after they've been flying for a long time. They're going to compare this specific helicopter's maintenance records to how well the Bell 412 usually performs.
So it's almost like giving the helicopter a complete medical checkup.
Exactly.
Comparing its health to all the other Bell 412s out there.
That's a good way to put it.
And while we're talking about scrutiny, let's go back to those survivor testimonies for a second. What kind of information could they give us that even a perfect black box might miss?
Well, think of it this way.
Okay.
The black box, even when it's working perfectly, it's only giving you the technical story of the flight.
Right.
But the survivors, they can give you something more, the human perspective.
That's true.
They can describe what the atmosphere was like in the cockpit.
Oh, wow.
Any worries the crew might have expressed, what they were seeing and feeling leading up to the crash. These details, they can be really important in figuring out the chain of events, especially if we're talking about pilot error.
It's like taking a black and white sketch and adding all the colors.
Exactly.
Filling in the emotional and human side of things that the data just can't capture.
Right. Their memories could help investigators pinpoint that exact moment where things went wrong.
It makes you think about the weight they must be carrying, not just from surviving a helicopter crash, but from knowing that their memories could be the key to solving this whole mystery.
It's a heavy burden.
And while we're waiting for that final report to give us some answers, I keep thinking about something you mentioned earlier about the public's trust in the GDF.
Yeah.
What could happen to the GDF if this investigation is seen as not being transparent enough, even if the findings themselves are sound?
Transparency is absolutely crucial in a situation like this. It's about public confidence.
Yeah.
If people think they're not being told the whole story or that information is being hidden, it's going to damage their trust in the institution.
I could see that.
This could have a ripple effect on everything, from recruitment to morale within the GDF to the public's willingness to even support their operations.
It's a good reminder that this investigation is about more than just figuring out what caused the crash.
Much more.
It's about accountability and making sure the GDF keeps its reputation as a trustworthy institution.
Right.
But let's shift gears for a bit. You mentioned earlier that certain helicopters can be vulnerable to certain weather conditions.
I did.
Were there any unusual weather patterns or anything like that on the day of the crash? Something that investigators might be considering?
That's always a big part of these aviation investigations. Weather plays a huge role in helicopter safety.
Yeah, makes sense.
Investigators are going to be analyzing those meteorological reports from the time of the crash very carefully. They're going to be looking for anything unusual.
Like what?
Sudden wind gusts, unexpected turbulence, problems with visibility, anything that could have contributed.
So even if the helicopter was perfectly fine, external factors like the weather could have turned things bad, kind of a perfect storm, so to speak.
Exactly. Even the best driver in the world can't always control what happens on the road. Unexpected conditions can challenge even the most experienced pilots and the most sophisticated aircraft.
It makes you think about this idea of cascading events.
Yeah.
One small thing goes wrong, then another and another, and it all builds up to something tragic. I imagine trying to prove or disprove that kind of chain of events is incredibly difficult in an investigation.
Oh, it definitely can be.
You're absolutely right. And these investigations, they're not about blaming anyone.
Right.
They're about carefully figuring out what happened so that we can prevent these kinds of tragedies in the future.
Exactly.
And as we wait for the final report, it's important to remember that every detail matters.
Every single piece of evidence.
It all helps us understand what happened.
It helps us build a more complete picture of that day.
And it helps us honor the memory of those who were lost and hopefully make things safer for everyone involved in Guyanese aviation.
Well said. And with this draft report done, we're one step closer to understanding what led up to this terrible crash.
We are. But as we've been talking about, this investigation is about more than just technical details and data. It's about the human lives lost, the complexities of pilot error, the importance of transparency, and making sure that the sacrifices of those brave servicemen were not in vain.
You know, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, it's important to remember that while the final report will give us some answers, it may not answer every single question.
True.
But it's the commitment to finding those answers, to learning from this tragedy, that really matters.
On that note, let's take a quick pause here and think about what we've covered so far.
Good idea.
We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into this investigation. We're back. And, I can't help but think about just the weight of this whole situation. The families who lost loved ones, the GDF going through all of this, and those 2 survivors who made it out. It's a lot to carry.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine being L.T. Crawford or Trial Jackson. They're not just dealing with the trauma of surviving the crash itself.
Right.
They're key witnesses in all of this. Their memories might hold crucial pieces to figure out what happened. It really highlights how these events affect people. It goes way beyond the crash itself.
It does make you think about, how do investigators even approach that?
Right.
Getting information from people who are dealing with trauma like this while still making sure their testimonies are accurate and objective.
It takes a lot of, sensitivity, expertise too, and really understanding how trauma affects memory.
Yeah.
Investigators, they're trained to approach survivors with a lot of empathy, recognizing that they're not just sources of information, they're people who've been through something horrific.
Right.
They use very specific techniques to help them remember things accurately without, leading them or making things worse.
It's a good reminder that these investigations aren't just about, cold, hard analysis.
Well,
it's about real people's stories, their strength, and the long process of healing.
Absolutely.
And speaking of moving forward, what could this mean for the GDF long term? I mean, depending on what the final report says.
Well, the findings could trigger a lot of changes, honestly.
Really?
Think about it. If the investigation finds some systemic problems, like maybe training wasn't adequate or there were oversights in maintenance.
Oh, wow.
The GDF would have to make some big changes to regain public trust and prevent this from happening again.
So that final report, it's not just an ending, it's potentially the start of a whole new chapter for the GDF.
Yeah, it is.
It's a lot of responsibility for the people conducting this investigation.
A lot of responsibility. They're not just piecing together the events of that day, they're potentially shaping the future of the Guyana Defense Force and how they protect the nation.
That's a powerful thought. As we wrap up this deep dive into the GDF helicopter crash investigation, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I'd say even in the midst of tragedy, there's always a chance to learn and grow. By carefully looking at what led to the crash, by understanding how complex pilot error can be, and by pushing for transparency and accountability, that's how we honor the memory of those we lost and work towards a safer future.
I couldn't have said it better myself. This incident, as awful as it was, really underscores how important it is to constantly improve aviation safety, the need for institutions to be open and honest, and the lasting impact these events have on people.
And while the final report may not have all the answers, it will give us valuable insights and keep the conversation going about aviation safety and how committed the GDF is to serving and protecting the people of Guyana.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to stay informed, keep asking those tough questions, and remember that honoring those we lost means demanding progress and accountability. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.